Being a woman in the Wild West was more dangerous than being an outlaw, and almost nobody talks about why. Not because of outlaws, not because of gunfights, because of the silence, the isolation, and the men who owned everything, including you. Women in the Wild West didn't live on the frontier. They endured it. And the stories they left behind were never meant to be found. What you're about to hear are the brutal realities of frontier life for women. Each one told through a real story, not summaries, not history lessons, moments. Women who boarded wagons full of hope and arrived, if they arrived at all, as something quieter, something already broken in places nobody could see. This is the untold history of the Wild West, and it is nothing like what you've been shown. Number 1. The saloon was not glamour. It was a battlefield. The piano's always playing. It's always playing. The room smells of whiskey, sawdust, and something older. Desperation, soaked into the floorboards over years of nights exactly like this one. Kerosene lamps throwing orange light across the walls, men 3 deep at the bar, miners, cowboys, drifters, gamblers, most of them drunk, some of them dangerous in ways not yet visible. And she's in the middle of it, working. History dressed her up in feathers and confidence and called her glamorous. What history left out was after closing time. Saloon girls weren't entertainers. They were expected to drink with customers whether they wanted to or not, keep men at the bar, keep them spending, tolerate whatever came with that, drunken men with guns every single night. In Deadwood, 1876, one of the most lawless towns in the Wild West, violent incidents inside saloons were recorded almost weekly. Women who worked those floors were assaulted with near total impunity. No manager coming, no one intervening. One former dance hall girl described a night a drunk miner pressed a gun to her temple because she refused to keep drinking past midnight. The bartender watched. Nobody moved. The room kept talking. She talked him down herself, voice steady, hands shaking beneath the bar where no one could see. But she quit the next morning. Most women couldn't, because the saloon, for all its violence, paid more than anything else available to a woman on the frontier. That trap was built deliberately. This was everyday life. And the next reality begins with a letter that promised everything and delivered something far darker. Number 2, prostitution was often not a choice. She stepped off the stagecoach with a carpet bag and a letter promising work, respectable work, a boarding house position, 3 weeks of travel to get here. She was 19 years old. The man who met her was well-dressed, soft-spoken. He took her bag and walked her to a building on the main street. Then he sat her down and explained the arrangement, travel cost, food, lodging, the dress they would provide her. All of it owed, one way to pay it off, no escape, no help, no way out. This was the debt bondage system feeding the frontier sex trade, and it swallowed thousands of women whole. Recruiters worked eastern cities and immigrant ports, targeting women with limited options and large hopes. The promises were always the same. The locked room at the end of the journey was always the same too. Chinese women suffered this with particular brutality. Throughout the 1850s to 1880s, an estimated 85% of Chinese women in San Francisco were living in conditions of sexual slavery, documented by missionary Donaldina Cameron, who spent decades fighting to reach them. Smuggled across the Pacific, some sold at auction, all handed debts designed so that freedom was mathematically impossible. Meg Cameron helped hundreds escape, breaking down doors at night, outrunning traffickers, navigating police forces entangled in the very network she was fighting. But for every woman she reached, there were dozens she never found. Women who died in those rooms, whose names were never written down. The frontier needed their labor. It did not care whether they had agreed. This wasn't rare. And this is where it gets darker, because not every woman who vanished into the Wild West was deceived. Some were taken. Number 3. Abduction and the life that was taken twice. It happens without warning. One moment, ordinary. Wind through grass, cook fire smoke, the low sounds of a settlement waking up, then hoofbeats, fast, too many, too close, then screaming, then silence. Cynthia Ann Parker was 9 years old when a raiding party struck Fort Parker, Texas, in May of 1836. 5 settlers killed, several taken. She was among them, carried north into Comanche territory, and here is where the story fractures. into something that cannot be resolved neatly. She was adopted into the Comanche, learned the language, the customs, the rhythms of a life entirely unlike the one she'd been born into. She married Pedinacona, a Comanche chief, had 3 children. By every account, she became Comanche. Her name was Natwa. She had a life. Then, in December 1860, Texas Rangers attacked her camp. They rescued her. She was 34 years old, 24 years Comanche. Her husband escaped in the chaos. Nor her sons, including the boy who would become the legendary Quanah Parker, were not with her. She was taken back to white society. She didn't want to go. She tried to escape multiple times, stopped eating, wept with the rawness of a woman watching her entire world recede, with no power to stop it. Her youngest daughter, Prairie, died of fever within 2 years. Cynthia Ann Parker died in 1870. She never saw her sons again. The cruelest truth, she was abducted twice, once as a child with no voice, and once as a grown woman, still with no voice. The West took her life twice over and called both times a rescue. For women in the Wild West, this was normal. But the next reality cuts deeper, because it wasn't just individual women stripped of protection, it was entire groups, erased by the very system meant to govern them. Number 4. Women of color. Had no protection under the law. She had built this, with her own hands, years of labor, refusing every attempt to move her from what was hers. And now she stood in a room full of men, trying to prove it. For black women, indigenous women, Chinese women, and Mexican women on the frontier. The legal system wasn't a flawed structure that occasionally failed them. It was a weapon. Black women carried freedom papers that frontier courts treated as optional. Property claims by black homesteaders were disputed and denied at rates far exceeding white settlers. Indigenous women had no legal standing. Their testimony was inadmissible. Their children could be removed, and were, like in staggering numbers, sent to boarding schools designed, in the founder's own words, to kill the Indian and save the man. Chinese women who had been trafficked had nowhere to turn. Police in many frontier cities were financially tied to the same networks running the trade. Women who sought help were sometimes returned directly to their traffickers. No protection, no recourse, no floor to stand on. And then, Mary Fields didn't ask permission. Born into slavery in Tennessee around 1832, she came west after emancipation and settled in Cascade, Montana. 6 feet tall, revolver and shotgun, cigars on the main street. In 1895, she became the first black woman hired as a United States mail carrier in American history. She never missed a delivery. In winters that stopped other carriers at their doors, stagecoach Mary strapped on snowshoes and walked her route on foot. She reportedly said, "I never looked for trouble, but I never walked away from it either." She was the exception. Hundreds of thousands of women of color had no such leverage, no legend forming around their name. They worked, they endured, and they were consumed by a system designed to ensure they had nowhere to appeal. Most of their names are gone, lost to a history that only recorded the people it considered worth remembering. And everything you've heard so far? That was the easier part of surviving the frontier. Because what's coming next isn't about raiders or traffickers or corrupt courts. It's the land itself, the journey, the very air they breathed. Stay with it, because this is where it gets worse. Number 5. A marriage was not a choice. It was a contract. She was 15. He was 41. The preacher asked if she consented, and the word hung in the air 1 second before her father's hand pressed gently against her back. She said yes, because there was no door in that room that led anywhere else. Marriage on the frontier wasn't romantic. For most women, it was a legal transfer from her father's authority to her husband's. Documented, witnessed, sealed, once complete, she ceased to exist as an independent person under the law. She couldn't own property. Everything she brought to the marriage became legally his, couldn't sign contracts alone. In many territories, couldn't keep custody of her own children if the marriage fell apart. Divorce was technically possible, practically catastrophic. A divorced woman faced social exile, financial ruin, and the open assumption the failure was hers. Damaged, unmarriageable, a burden. So, women stayed, through coldness, through cruelty, through violence that left marks no one was permitted to see. One Nebraska settler wrote in her private journal in 1874, carefully, guardedly, the way you write when dangerous eyes might one day find the pages. He is not a gentle man, but the law made him my keeper, and the land made me his prisoner. And I have learned to move very quietly through this house. Her daughter found it after her death. She had never shown it to a single person, because silence was the only protection she could build for herself. No court, no neighbor. No law that recognized what was happening inside that house as wrong. This was expected, and the danger wasn't only inside the home, it was waiting the moment she tried to leave. Number 6. The trail could kill you before you arrived. Everything left behind. Your mother's house, the church, the graves of people you loved, 6 weeks on a wooden wagon, hands cracked and bleeding, a feverish baby who won't eat. The woman ahead lost her husband to cholera 3 days ago and hasn't spoken since. Somewhere in present-day Wyoming, 600 miles left. The Oregon Trail killed between 10,000 and 30,000 people across its peak years, one grave for every 100 yards. Read that again. One grave. Every 100 yards. Women didn't just suffer this journey, they ran it. While cooking over open fires in windstorms, washing clothes in rivers so cold their hands went numb, walking beside the wagons for miles each day because the oxen were already failing under the weight. They gave birth on the trail, in moving wagons, on open ground, no shelter, no privacy, no one nearby who had done this before. Narcissa Whitman, one of the first white women to cross the Rockies in 1836, was celebrated as a pioneer. What the celebration skipped was the cost. She arrived in Oregon hollowed out, buried her daughter within 3 years, dead herself within 11. The trail didn't kill her directly, it dismantled her, long before anything else could. The trail didn't just take lives, it erased them, 1 mile at a time. And that still wasn't the worst part. Some dangers didn't announce themselves. Some came quietly, through the water. Number 7. Childbirth was a death sentence in disguise. And if the journey didn't kill you, what came next might. No hospitals, no doctors, no one in the wagon party who has done this more than once, just canvas above you, snapping in the wind, the wagon still moving, and the knowledge, cold in your chest, whatever happens next, happens here. Childbirth on the frontier was among the most lethal experiences a woman could face. Not because it was unusual, it was relentlessly, exhaustingly usual, but because the conditions made what should have been survivable, regularly fatal. Hemorrhage, infection, prolonged labor with no intervention, babies positioned wrong with no trained hands to help. Women knew this. They prepared wills before due dates, wrote farewell letters, and pressed them into Bible pages, just in case. One woman crossing to California in 1852 delivered her baby successfully in the early hours of the morning. By noon, the woman in the next wagon was dead from the same experience. She wrote that evening, "What separates the living from the dead today seems to be nothing more than luck." After, women were expected to recover fast, not out of cruelty, but because nothing existed that allowed otherwise. Meals to cook, children to tend, land to work, no rest, no recovery, no acknowledgement that she had survived something that should have been terrifying. And yet, somehow, women still laughed out here, still fell in love, still built lives in places that were actively trying to erase them. They celebrated harvests and told stories by firelight and held each other's children when the grief got too heavy to carry alone. That resilience wasn't weakness dressed up as strength. It was something else entirely, but it didn't make what came next any easier. Number 8. Disease had no mercy on the frontier. But the worst part wasn't the journey, it was what followed you. First comes the thirst, then the cramps, then the fever, rising so fast, it feels like your blood has been replaced with something burning. By the time you recognize it, the disease has already decided. Cholera was the frontier's most efficient killer. No warning, no preference. A healthy adult at sunrise, dead before dark. Out here, the sickness didn't spread slowly. It erased entire families before anyone could understand what was happening. Women were always at the center of it because women were the caregivers. Children sick, mothers stayed, husbands down, wives sat through the night beside them. Neighboring homestead infected, women crossed the distance, carrying water, food, whatever help they could spare. In staying close, they absorbed everything. Summer 1850. A cholera outbreak swept the Platte River Road so violently that travelers reported mass graves every mile for days of travel. One widow lost her husband on Tuesday, her oldest son Wednesday, her two youngest daughters by Saturday. 4 burials, 4 days. Then she climbed back onto the wagon, 2 surviving children, nowhere to go but forward. On dysentery, typhoid, scarlet fever, smallpox, measles tearing through indigenous communities, then reversing into frontier settlements on the rebound. No disease the Wild West didn't carry. And the women nursing everyone through it were always the last ones anyone protected. What came next wasn't a disease. It was something women built their entire lives inside, and still couldn't escape. Number 9. The homestead could bury you alive. From a distance, the sod house almost looks peaceful, low to the earth, a thin curl of smoke rising into a sky so vast, everything beneath it feels small. Step inside. Packed earth walls, dirt floor, ceiling held up by timber, and faith. Always damp, always dark, always something rotting just below the surface. When it rains, the ceiling doesn't leak. It dissolves, mud-laden sheets coming down, ruining food, soaking children in their sleep, wall sections collapsing with a sound you feel before you hear, snakes through the floor, insects in the walls, winters that barely climbed above freezing, summer heat stored in the walls, and released through the night, sleep in active endurance. The psychological weight broke people. Beret Hansa came to the Dakota Territory from Norway, carrying faith in the new world like a lantern from home. What she found was the prairie, flat, endless, silent in a way that wasn't peaceful, but consuming. She deteriorated, the isolation, the pressing darkness, the wind that never stopped. She became convinced the house was a burial chamber. She stopped eating, lost the thread between present and past. Her story was later fictionalized in Ole Edvard Rolvag's A Giants in the Earth, drawn directly from documented accounts of immigrant women across the plains. They came for land. They got a grave with a roof. For women in the Wild West, this was normal. If the homestead was a trap, the next one had no walls at all. Number 10. Loneliness could destroy you from the inside. Not the comfortable quiet of an early morning, the other kind. Unbroken for 11 weeks. No knock at the door, no letter, no voice that isn't asking something from you. The kind with physical weight, pressing your chest at waking, sitting across from you at meals, following you through rooms that have stopped feeling real. Frontier isolation was a psychological catastrophe, and it found women first. The men could ride to town, saloons, trading posts, other ranchers, brief human contact. Women on remote homesteads could go months without speaking to another adult woman. One Dakota Territory family survived 68 consecutive days without leaving their soddy. 68 days, dark, cold, silent. Frontier physicians reported women made up the vast majority of prairie madness patients, depression, dissociation, complete collapse, common enough to have a name. A Kansas newspaper reported in 1873 that a settler woman had been found wandering the open plains, barefoot, in January, 12 miles from her homestead. She couldn't explain why she'd left or where she'd been going. Her husband found her before she froze, but the woman he brought home was not the same woman who'd walked out that door. The Wild West promised space. What it gave women was emptiness. Some women didn't die on the frontier. They simply stopped existing, long before their bodies did. At least, loneliness was invisible. The next reality had a face. It rode into town on horseback, and it carried a medical bag. Number 11. The doctor was absent, or worse, present. The nearest doctor is 60 miles away. Your daughter has been burning for 3 days. Cool cloths, herbs, prayer, until the words stop meaning anything. Nothing breaking the fever. 3 feet of snow outside, 60 miles, medical care on the frontier, ran from dangerously inadequate to actively lethal. Sometimes the doctor didn't save you. He finished what the illness started. Physicians ranged from genuinely trained to complete frauds. No licensing boards, no oversight, no way to know which had just ridden into town. Common treatment in the 1860s and 1870s, bloodletting, draining a patient's blood to rebalance the body. Centuries of evidence that it killed people, still in use, still performed on women and children in frontier cabins. For women, it was worse. Female pain was routinely dismissed as nerves or hysteria. A diagnosis meaning, in practice, we don't believe you. Treated with sedatives that addressed nothing. Gynecological conditions went unexamined because examination was considered indecent. Women died of treatable conditions because no one was permitted to look closely enough to find them. And then, they built their own medicine. Handwritten remedy journals traded between homesteads. Bones set, wounds stitched, teeth pulled. Procedures no untrained person should ever have to attempt. One Wyoming woman's 1879 diary pulled her own tooth, pliers, 3 attempts. She did not cry. Went back to work that afternoon. This was expected. The danger didn't stop at home. The moment a woman had to move, new threats were already waiting. Number 12. Stagecoach travel was a rolling nightmare. The coach lurches before you find your grip, both hands on the strap, 12 passengers in a space built for 8, dust through every gap and coating your teeth, filling your throat, someone's trunk finding your ankle on every bend, 380 miles left, brutal for everyone. V for women, it carried dangers the ticket price didn't mention. Unheated in winter, an oven in summer, roads barely cut into rock and dried mud, capable of throwing an unsecured passenger into the ceiling without warning. Rest stops overcrowded, filthy. Run by men with no investment in female safety, no facilities, no privacy, no guarantees. And then, the robberies, not the cinematic kind, real ones, doors swinging open, guns already drawn, the immediate understanding of how little control you have. Women were targeted. Robbers knew they carried jewelry, wedding rings, coins stitched into dress hems, because there was nowhere safer. Not all of them stopped at theft. A Pinkerton report from 1877 documented an Arizona Territory robbery, where 2 female passengers were dragged from the coach at gunpoint and held for hours in the dark while the robbers decided what came next. They survived. Not every account from the road did. And still, women had no alternative. You climbed in, held the strap, prayed the next stop came before the trouble did. Number 13. Native women were targeted by the government itself. The West was not empty land. It was home. Home for thousands of years to nations, families, and women who had built entire worlds on that ground before any settler wagon appeared on the horizon. What happened to those women is not a footnote to the history of the Wild West. It is the history of the Wild West. Native women faced violence that was not incidental, systematic, organized. Funded by the United States government, executed with military precision, November 1864, Sand Creek, Colorado Territory, a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment, flying an American flag, flying a white flag of truce, exactly as instructed, attacked at dawn by United States Army forces under Colonel John Chivington. Between 150 and 200 people killed, the majority women and children. Survivors' testimonies recorded in congressional investigations were so specific and so consistent across dozens of accounts that the committee had no choice. They called it a massacre. Chivington was never charged, and Sand Creek was not the exception. Across the frontier, the destruction moved through multiple channels at once: military assault, forced removal, children taken to boarding schools, are designed to surgically remove indigenous identity. Not a side effect of expansion, the method of it. These women were not casualties of someone else's conflict. They were targets, the first to lose everything, before the wagon trains, before the homestead claims, before every other reality on this list was possible. For women in the Wild West, this was normal. And what comes last may be the most suffocating reality of all, because it means every woman who endured everything you've just heard had no voice, no legal standing, no way to make anyone listen. Number 14. A woman's voice. Had no legal weight. She saw him do it, standing in the doorway, 6 feet away, full daylight, watched every second, remembered every detail. And when she told the judge exactly what she witnessed, he looked at her with the patience of a man who had already decided and said, a woman's testimony, standing alone, was not sufficient. He needed a man to confirm it. There was no man. Case dismissed. Legal disenfranchisement of women on the frontier was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. Couldn't vote, couldn't serve on juries, couldn't hold public office, couldn't sign a binding contract without a husband's signature. Their word worth less, by law. In cases of domestic violence, consistent, pervasive, running through frontier communities like groundwater, the law sided with the husband, structurally, by design. There are documented cases of women who fled abusive marriages, had walked into sheriff's offices with visible injuries, and were physically returned to their husbands by the same men they'd come to for help. Because legally, she was his. Property with a name. The women who resisted built what they could. Quiet networks between homesteads, tracking which men were dangerous, which roads weren't safe, which towns had anyone worth trusting. Some wrote, organized, petitioned legislatures with no interest in listening. Some simply survived, day by day, inside a structure engineered to make survival as costly as possible. Every single one fought harder than history recorded. Every single one deserved better than they received. And every single one did it without one law written in their favor. 14 stories. And behind each of them, thousands more just like them. Women who never appeared in the history books, never celebrated, never named, who simply endured, season after season, in silence, holding together a world that was actively trying to break them. They built schools in towns that didn't yet have roofs, kept children alive through winters that killed grown men, buried the dead, and returned to work before anyone asked how they were holding up. They were not background characters in someone else's story. They were the story. The hidden architecture of the American frontier, invisible by design, essential by necessity. History handed the Wild West to the cowboys, but it was women who kept it from collapsing. The Wild West wasn't freedom for women, it was survival. And every single morning they woke up and chose to keep going was an act of courage that nobody wrote down. The Wild West didn't just test women, it erased the ones who couldn't survive it. History remembered the cowboys, but it survived because of the women. And now,